See you. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for asking me.
Good morning, Dick.
Good morning.
Morning, Carrie.
Morning, everybody.
Let's see. So we're still waiting on maybe Rick. Text. Rick come in yet, Jordan?
No, I have not seen him. I also have not heard, I haven't got an email or anything.
All right. Yeah, I hadn't seen an email, so I just texted him. So give him another minute. And hey, Bruce. So, Jordan, why don't I get things started, get our roll call going, and then hopefully Rick will be able to join us when he's available. So we'll call to order the meeting of the Fiscal Policy Work Group of the School Funding Commission, and today's the last day of August 31st, 2020 at a little after 10 o'clock in the morning. And as per the governor's emergency order for remote meetings and our policies consistent with that, we're going to just sort of go through and call the roll, see who's online, and we'll get started into our agenda. So I'll start it off. Dave Luneau here in Hopkinton with Ozzie the long-haired dachshund. And I see John Beardmore is with us.
I am in Hopkinton, alone in my office, although my family is around the house.
Great, thanks, John. And Mary Heath?
Mary Heath here in Manchester, and my husband's in the other room.
Great, you've got it. That's an amazing garden, Mary.
Oh, thank you. I love it.
And that's not a backdrop, right? That's
that's
live.
my backyard.
Right,
see
right.
You can see a turkey over there.
Oh, is there?
Yeah, we had a turkey on the fence. It stood
Oh,
there
okay.
for a long time. It was
Yeah.
about an hour. And then it had a bunch of other, well, what do you call it, a gaggle or something?
Yeah. So great. Thanks, Mary. And Chris Dwyer?
Chris Dwyer, I'm actually up in Maine in Soamesville.
Oh, wow. Great to have you this morning, Chris. And Dick Ames?
Yeah, Dick Ames. I'm here in Jaffrey in my home.
Okay, thanks. Nice to see you, Dick. And Bill Ardinger's with us this morning.
Sure, in Cottyhunk, but I got no turkeys here, just family here with me.
Great. Thanks for coming in, Bill. And we got Mel Myler.
Yeah, this is Mr. Mel. I'm calling in from Port Clyde, Maine.
Great. Thanks, Mel. And let's see, from Carsey School, we've got Carrie Portree.
Hi, Carrie Portree. I'm in Dover. My husband's in the other room.
Great. Thanks. And Jordan Hensley.
Jordan Hensley, also here in Dover. My fiance is in the other room.
Great. And we've got Bruce Mallory.
Calling in from Kittery Point, home alone.
Great. Thanks. And we've got jferrini, our guest from Portsmouth today. So welcome, Jane.
Hi, I'm here in my office at City Hall. I'm on Junkins Ave in Portsmouth.
Great. Thanks, Jane. So I don't think I missed anybody looking at here. And I think we've got, we've got, let's see, eight people attending, 6 via Zoom, and two on dial-in. So thanks to all the attendees for tuning in today. Jordan, how are we looking on tech?
I think we're all good this morning.
Terrific. Then Jordan, if you don't mind, I'll turn it over to you to introduce our guest this morning, and we'll start here.
Sure. Thanks, everybody. Good morning. Yeah, so the first thing we wanted to start with was we've been in the works for a little while now, trying to talk with Jane Ferrini, who is an attorney with the city of Portsmouth, and to just kind of give us the Portsmouth perspective on local municipal taxes, schools, and some of the impacts on Portsmouth, and just kind of to get their perspective, to get a different kind of perspective than some of the ones that we've heard. And so she's just gonna start with that, and then hopefully we'll just lead us into a conversation. It's not going to be a totally formal presentation, as I understand it, but more a discussion and dialogue to try to deepen our understanding on how these issues impact Portsmouth and communities like Portsmouth across the state.
Great. I should also point out too that Jane was very, very involved in all of this past session's House Education Committee meetings when discussing school funding and various proposals, and she made probably more trips to Concord than she cares to remember, but very attentive to all the committee's work, which I think a lot of people know resulted in a significant increase in state funding overall to public education in New Hampshire. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jane.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you all remotely. Yes, as Dave said, I am an assistant city attorney with the city of Portsmouth. One of the roles I inherited was to track legislation of interest to the city on behalf of the city. And obviously a big piece of that is education funding. So what the city does is we basically are a conduit of information to other former donor towns as well. You might have remembered the coalition communities, which were the former donor towns that had a very vocal and visible presence. We actually had a full-time lobbyist, Pat Remick. Many of you remember her good work over the years. And over the last several years, I've tracked legislation, and in a general way, again, this is just sort of explaining my role and sort of how the information is going to come to you. This is just information that I've gathered from the city of Portsmouth to give you a little bit of a different perspective and maybe give you some information about what's happening currently in the city and sort of where we came from back in the early 2000s with the Donortown issue. One of the things I found in my travels was a letter from city manager John Bohenko in 2003. And it's the budget letter that he wrote. And I think it would be interesting just to hear a few paragraphs of that as right when the SWEPT issue was significant. I think the statistics are something like over 6 years, Portsmouth contributed SWEP in the amount of about $11 million for a 6-year period of time. So this is one of those years. This is the budget letter from 2003. And it says, the budget reflects an overall property tax increase of 4.5%. It should be noted that despite the reduction in the municipal portion of the proposed tax rate, the overall rate will increase solely because of the increase in the state and county taxes. In order to provide a greater understanding of the cost of local services and other expenditures, below is an illustration using a home with an assessed value of $263,000, the average value for a single-family home in Portsmouth. With a proposed rate of $20.14, the annual property tax in this example would be $5,296.82. If the legislature immediately repeals the statewide property tax, with all factors remaining constant, the tax would decrease. Well, we know that didn't happen, but here's just a few brief comments. Since FY 2000, the city of Portsmouth has been forced to send $6.7 million to Concord to pay for education in other towns. For FY 2004, the Department of Revenue Services and the Department of Education released information that requires Portsmouth to send an additional $5.9 million, which equates to $2.2 million or 59% more than FY 03. This will be a total of $12.6 million from Portsmouth. And then in addition to levying the statewide property tax, the state of New Hampshire continues to balance its books on the backs of county property taxpayers by forcing down certain costs. Our share of the Rockingham County budget remains extremely high because it too is tied to the property values. As you can see from the chart below, our share of the county taxes has climbed to over $3.8 million, almost double the cost of just 3 years ago. During the past few years, we've been able to utilize the growth of our tax base and a strong economy to both expand services and maintain a stable tax rate. But that has changed. We are faced with the continued tax increases from both the state and county governments that are outside of our control. Last year, we were able to simply mainstream services through a modest increase in revenue and through budgetary and staff reductions to offset rising fixed costs. In fiscal year 2004, the statewide property tax, coupled with our share of the Rockingham County budget, will force Portsmouth taxpayers to send almost $9.8 million out of the city, more than the cost to run some of our major departments. This is a combined increase of nearly $2.5 million over FY 03. Over the past 6 years, we have worked to improve our financial stability, invested wisely in our infrastructure, and expanded services and public safety by moderately increasing the operating budget by less than inflation. Although this budget presents a 0% operating increase, we must undergo severe belt tightening, delay projects, and require all departments to make cutbacks in order to offset rising fixed costs. This bare bones approach cannot continue indefinitely without a critical impact on our level of services, and therefore we must continue to work for elimination of the statewide property tax. So that just was really at the apex of the SWEPT donor town. But I thought it was just be interesting to look back at that snapshot and what those numbers were at the time. As you know, there was a very strong push by the donor towns to repeal the statewide education property tax. That was not a successful appeal. And I have to say that the sentiment behind that, as you all are well aware, as many residents of donor towns and many residents of non-donor towns believe that the statewide education property tax is in essence, not a statewide tax, it's a local tax. And I think one of the things this commission is trying to address is what do we have to do, and who do we have to listen to try to inform a conversation about education funding. And I think that premise is a very strongly held premise by residents of donor towns. Whether or not the Supreme Court says it's a statewide property tax or not, I think the feeling is it's a local tax, and that the state slapped the label on it to fulfill its obligation for education funding. And this probably isn't new to many of you, because most of you have been talking about this issue much longer than I have. But that's just a thought that I have, and a sentiment that I have looking back over some of the earlier press releases and commentary from my predecessor. One of the things you all know, and I've been watching your meetings, so I know you realize that what came from some of this is the Sorrell case and the whole property valuation issue, which, now New Hampshire has a fair and equitable way to assess property. But I think way back in time, the Sorrell case was brought because when the SWEPT issue was going on, there were problems with valuation. I don't think you have that now as far as an issue to address. The other thing that was, I think, an issue back early on is the income issue for residents. And I think this commission is really drilling down on that issue and looking at, various possible funding mechanisms that address the income issue. I know back in the early 2000s, I think the coalition communities actually funded a study on income, because I think back then, let's say, for example, Portsmouth was a donor town, and I think it was paying Bedford and Stratford, and, because of statistics and such, but there wasn't an accounting for income. And I think Portsmouth looked very different in the early 2000s than it does now as far as the income level of its residents. But back in 2000, and the income was not as high as it is now. And also, our statistics on, the differential aid students, the free and reduced lunch and all of the English as a second language, all of that was, I don't think people knew Portsmouth had the numbers that it had then, and even have the numbers that it has now. But certainly that is a significant change. One of the things that, this is just me talking, not just an observation. I don't know if any of you had the chance to look at the amicus brief filed by the senators and the representatives. And one of the other things that it dawned on me when I read that brief is, in addition to folks that feel like it's a local tax, regardless of its label, you also have folks who believe it's a separation of powers issue in this whole education funding issue, and it should solely be, the ability of the legislature to do what they wish. And many legislators are very upset, I think, by Claremont and its progeny, and they're not necessarily from donor towns. Not that sways your formula in any way, but I think some of the issues you're grappling with are broad ones. So I just thought I would throw that out there. There's some interesting demographics in Portsmouth and the property tax and commercial property, and I just thought I'd send you some of those statistics. So we have a population of 22,576. 30% of our population is over 55 years of age, and only 18% of our population have folks between the ages of 1 and 19. So a very small percentage of our households that have children. The median family income is $100,370, but the median household income is $72,384. And 6.9% of the households are below poverty. The demographics are interesting. 34.9% are one-person households. 41.8% are two-person households. And then 19.1% have children 18 or younger. And this is another interesting statistic. 48% of our households rent. So that means conversely, 52% of our households are owner occupied. And the commercial, let's see. Okay, so the median single family residential house value now is $470,850. So you compare that to the 200 and something from the 2003 budget, you obviously see a dramatic change in the single family residential values. The mean value for commercial property is $1,738,135, and the median gross rent is $1,464. Our economy is 12% leisure and hospitality. These were last year's figures, not COVID figures. 13% retail, and 16% education and health. And we know all of those sectors of the economy have been affected by COVID. I'm sorry I don't have current statistics, but I'm assuming the statistics are the same. So the commercial versus residential parcels, we have taxable parcels, 84% are residential and 16% are commercial. And the total percent of total assessed values is 58% residential and 42% commercial. So one of the things I think you've talked about is the aging of New Hampshire, the changing demographics of New Hampshire, and boy, is Portsmouth demonstrating that. You know, surprising to me was the amount of single family households. That's a huge percentage. And then the two-family, two-person, some of those could be single parents. I'm just guessing it's not, but I would say that percent is probably smaller than, but again, that is not any basis in statistics that I'm aware of. And then the small amount of percentage of the number of children that in the households. So I think, and then the other interesting statistic is, so we have, let's say 50% of our property is residential, 50% of the residents rent. So it's a very interesting small population of single family or residential folks that are paying the property tax to fund the expenses of the city. One of the things I did is we have a lot of property tax abatement in the city of Portsmouth. We budget over $1 million a year to address those particular issues. One of the things that the legislature has grappled with over many years is how to accurately assess properties that are commercial. It's relatively easy for folks to assess residential property because there's turnover and there's sales statistics, but commercial property is a little more challenging because some communities it may not sell as much. So your way to value it is a little bit complicated. And so we have a current liability list for tax abatements pending over 3 years of $2,581. $2,581, and it's mostly commercial. And there's a few facts people don't know about commercial abatement process, and I am absolutely no expert, but it's interesting to note that it's that there's 6% interest that's paid on that. So that money's paid in, and then interest, the city would be responsible to pay interest on that tax. But that's a 6% interest rate, which is quite high. It's higher than most savings accounts. The other thing people aren't aware of, and our assessor informed me of this, is that at least in our town, most of those abatements are filed by representatives, and they get paid a percentage. They get paid 30% of what they recover. And so the incentive to settle quickly isn't necessarily there because of that particular factor. And this is one of the main things our assessor wanted me to address, and I know she's been involved over the years in various comments on legislation about this, is there's no obligation to give income and expense and rent rolls from commercial properties. They can and they may, but they don't have to. And that affects how you can assess commercial property. my understanding is in Massachusetts and Maine, if you do not provide income and expense and rent rolls, you can't appeal. You can't file for an abatement. Our assessor also mentioned to me that the legislature has taken away tools for assessors over the last several years, the ability to enter property, if not, they weren't allowed to file an appeal. So there have been some erosions to that, which make it a little more challenging to assess commercial property. And without the accurate assessment of the commercial property, no, I'm not saying it's inaccurate, but without some of these tools, let's say, there's a risk that commercial property is a bit undervalued, and that puts the burden on the residential property owners to pay the property tax. So one of the things they also, okay, I think that was pretty much some of the points that our assessor wanted to make. And one of the simple things, I'm not talking about swept, but I'm talking about some of our elderly residents who have lived in their homes for many, many years. And it's tremendous that the values of residential property has gone up. But obviously that's great if you sell your property. If you're on a fixed income and you're living in property that has almost, doubled, tripled, I mean, I don't even know. I know several folks being from here for so long that have lived in their property for many, many years. But, if you have a $200,000 house and the tax rate's $38 per $100,000, or you have a $400,000 house and your tax rate is 16, it's even though it sounds like the streets are paved with gold, we have had, and they can abate, and they can have elderly tax abatements and things like that, but there is a burden on a property tax owner to pay taxes when the values go up and they're not particularly interested in selling. One of the things that this commission has addressed, and I think there have been some letters sent by some former donor towns about what % of income goes to property tax, and I think this commission has talked about that, and I think that's an interesting factor to look at. And maybe not so much in Portsmouth, but I think there are some former donor towns where you have a corner of a lake perhaps, but you're a small town. You have several very lovely and prosperous residents or summer residents, but then you have the rest of the town that really isn't equal in that income, and perhaps property, maybe their property value is skewered or higher as a result of some of the more expensive properties in town, but the day-to-day and the income and the percentage of income that they pay for taxes, property taxes, is probably a statistics that would be interesting. One of the other factors that is also interesting, and that I know that we can't address it, is what is the impact of COVID going to be? I know that you as a commission are not going to be considering COVID when you make your recommendations, but certainly the burden on the property tax for any increase it's going to be felt. It's going to be felt by all of our New Hampshire residents, and I think you've heard from your focus groups, which had a wide variety of people from all over the state, that the burden on the property tax is already substantial, and that some other means of funding education would be really a direction that I'm sure former donor towns and non-donor towns would urge this commission to look at. And one of the other things that is really impossible to quantify, but different towns are managed in very different ways. Different school departments are managed in very different ways. it's just, it's so hard to have a one size fits all. And I think that's what, you know, when you're talking about targeted aid to those communities that need it, you know, that's something that this commission has spent a substantial amount of time looking at, and, you know, continuing to look at that. One of the things you worry about with the property tax, and this commission's already talked about this, elderly residents versus children with families. Is this going to become a fight, you know, between those that have kids in the system and those that don't? You know, the other interesting issue, I've read in several articles about people that, or younger people, millennials, who aren't having children versus those that are having children. So it might not even just be the elderly folks versus non. It might be, you know, millennial folks who are choosing not to have children versus those who are funding the system. And one of the things that I've been reading lately is the whole population decline, and the decline in student population, and the decline in birth rates. There's been some articles around saying that COVID was going to be, you know, this great statistical increase in birth rates, but several articles have indicated that's not been the case. So the whole issue of decreasing population, and the whole issue of remote learning is an interesting concept insofar as I know this commission has grappled with transportation costs, and that is a real issue. But query, if we go to more remote learning, and, you know, maybe COVID is going to have some long-term effects even when it's gone, about how we as a state and how the country teaches students. Certainly maybe not the littles, you know, the little ones, but maybe the middle school and the high school kids. It could be a very different picture as we roll out post-COVID, and certainly during COVID, it's very different. So, you know, also the insurance, the banking, the tech industries, they're all going remote. And also for purposes of preparing our students, you know, for the future, if many of these major, you know, industries are going remote, are they going to stay remote? And is remote learning part of our curriculum to consider if that is how people are going to work in the workplace? These are just questions. I certainly don't have answers, but and I say this, there's a phrase, you know, don't be a general fighting the last war. You know, things are changing so fast, and I just don't know how you as a commission or we as citizens, you know, we anticipate what's coming next with education and education funding. You know, we all are facing a new normal, and I think there will be major changes. I don't know what they're going to be, but I certainly think more remote learning is probably going to be a part of our future of education, you know, moving forward, and how we fund that, and how we look at that, and how that changes our brick and mortar, you know, expenses and our transportation expenses. I have no answers at all for that, but it is something to contemplate. And I think one of the other things that is unique to Portsmouth that I wanted to relay is also the hospitality industry. And I think from the meals and rooms, we get, based on population, so I think the city gets about 1,124,000, something like that. One of the other burdens on the property tax folks is the funding of infrastructure and support for tourism. Yes, buildings, restaurants pay taxes, and yes, you know, that is all part of, you know, the overall budgetary picture. But there are a lot of events that require public works. There's a lot of support. There are special fire engines you have to have when you have a hotel that's so many floors. Those are all funded by the taxpayer supporting the tourism economy. And although some people vehemently oppose it, I think Portsmouth has been in the forefront of trying to have a hotel occupancy surcharge. That has not been successful over the last several years. I'm certain it's not going to be proposed this year, given our hotel industry's current economy. But that's another economic factor that affects Portsmouth. And quite honestly, I think some of the citizens are not as enamored as others about all the festivals and the impact that they have, and the cost that they require. And the other issue is the state's downshifting of costs on all municipalities. That's something that, I think Meals and Rooms is at 20%. It's supposed to be at 40% distribution. That's something that would help every municipality. It doesn't look like it's going to change anytime soon. But then the other downshifting costs that you hear from the New Hampshire Municipal Association that the state has over the course of the last, decade or so has had a fiscal impact on all municipalities. And it all relates in some ways, because you're talking about budgets and you're talking about what's now the responsibility of local municipalities that the state used to have, as its responsibility. And again, with COVID, none of that's going to get resolved, certainly in the next year or so. But again, those are sort of undercurrents that constantly come up when you're talking about, the citizens are talking about budgets and what they're responsible for funding versus what they were responsible for funding years ago. So I don't have a lot of answers. I respect the efforts. I've been watching the meetings. I have been, listening in on what you all are doing. I think the outreach that's coming up in the fall is important. I know with COVID, you were going to take your show on the road, but I don't think you can do that other than remotely now. I think it's really important to engage all the different communities that you can. You certainly last session heard from and a lot of legislation. There was a lot of cities and towns that came out that supported changes to the funding. But I think it's important I think some of you have said to educate all of the citizens, to talk about this broadly, and to come up with a fair way to fund. But I would submit that if it is just SWEPT, and even the whole issue of the retention of SWEPT, I believe that would not be supported by former donor towns, and then you're back into an uncomfortable few sessions in the legislature and opposition to that. So, but again, I think that's also a small piece. I think that's a small piece of the overall issues that you're grappling with. I think it's a system that has been taxed literally and figuratively, the property tax, and I think it's a real challenge to use that as a base of education funding moving forward.
Jane, Jane, thank you very much, and thanks for sharing, your perspectives, but also I think a lot of sort of the historical efforts here in New Hampshire that have really got us to where we are today. Would you be willing to spend a few minutes, take some questions from?
Sure, if I can answer them, and if I can, I will talk to our the lovely finance and assessors and the people that
No,
have more
that-
information, or school departments, if
that-
you would like more specifics.
Yeah, no, that would be great. Thanks, Jane. And actually, before I sort of open it up to members of the commission for questions, one of the things that I was particularly interested in was when you were commenting on your conversation with your city assessors, or the assessing department, and I've gotten some feedback from others as well about things in our assessing laws that probably fall short, or have been rolled back, or have or could be actually made, if certain questions were asked, made more useful for fair assessing across the state. But if you've got if there's a memo or something like that I'm not asking to put a lot of work together, but at some point coming up this fall, I think we're going to be looking at what sort of RSAs could be impacted by the work that we're doing, and I think the areas of assessing certainly could be one of those areas. So I'd love to get your
I
feedback.
do have a white paper, I think they call it, from the assessing board. It was
Chris is nodding, so it looks like she's seen it.
2015. Yeah, and I can send that to you, Dave, and it talks about these issues that I very briefly brushed over.
Fantastic.
And I can send that to you if you'd
That
like.
would be great. That would be a huge help. So
Yeah.
thanks, Jen. So let me open it up. Who's got their hands up? Just sort of raise it up this way. So I think I've got everybody on board. Let me start with Chris, since you're right in the same neck of the woods here.
Well, I'm glad you're going to look at the assessing piece, because basically commercial abatement is a business, and the because we have a high, almost 50% of our assessed value is commercial. The statistics that Jane talked about that are important, that are really sort of changing things, really only 25% are homeowners in Portsmouth who are largely feeling that they're bearing an overwhelming amount of the brunt of increased taxes, with a high percentage of those over 55. When you add that 25% of the homeowners, a high percentage over 55, a high percentage of those single owners of homes, you kind of get the picture of why there is this large concern of the people bearing any increases in taxes are over 55 single homeowners. They're people who've often lived in Portsmouth for a long, long time, and now really won't be able to sustain that. And in a way, as Jane said, through no fault of their own, but based on the way we are required to assess property, their values have gone up way beyond the point where they can be sustained. And so, yes, we do, elderly abatements, we've increased those. But that pinch is really felt, especially when you combine that with the rooms and meals, which is not based on assessed valuation, but based on population. And I think we've estimated that Portsmouth pays 40% of Rockingham County's rooms and meals taxes, even though our population is around 8%. So you combine the being pinched in multiple ways, it's really falling on that small percentage of homeowners. And if commercial were more fairly assessed, that might balance out a little bit more. But the commercial for us in Portsmouth, we realize that's unique, but it will apply to some other towns as well, is a big part of that.
So thanks, Chris. And I know John's got his hand up too, but I just want to poke on this question a little bit, because obviously, and Jane, I think you did a great job when you sort of summarized the Sorrell case and what the situation was back in 2000, and how that's largely been that element of it has largely been addressed. by the work of the Department of Revenue Administration, but yet there's still an issue with respect to fair assessing of commercial property. And other than the sort of like I know you brought up other issues with regards to that, but is that a really sort of like a fundamental structural problem with how we do property taxes in New Hampshire right now?
I think the valuation for commercial, this issue has come up through legislation in the past, I think several times. So it's not just Portsmouth. And I think the whole issue of, what information you get from the commercial owners, it does according to our assessor impede the ability. If you don't get it, it impedes your ability to accurately assess a value of the commercial. So I think for Portsmouth's perspective, and probably from other communities that have commercial property, it would be, and I think the assessing board, definitely the white paper supported some of these changes that have been either taken away or not required in New Hampshire. So I think that is an issue when just looking at the overall assessment of commercial property. It's an important thing to look at.
So just sort of taking that a little bit further, and I'm looking at the DRA's 2019 report, but the equalized school tax rate in Portsmouth is $4.38. And if there were a higher assessed valuation of commercial property, then that would suggest that would even be lower than that. Is that correct? That
Yeah,
that
it could
the rate
be. I
is
think
actually
that's how
higher
the
than
math would work. The math
Yeah.
would work. But the assessed value for commercial property was brought up insofar as the overall discussion of burden on the residential property. Like,
Right.
Why is the taxpayer feeling the way the taxpayer is feeling? And I think Chris said it's the 25% feels that they are paying, as opposed to the commercial folks. I know we had reevaluation, I don't know, several years ago, and that's when this issue really came forward in Portsmouth, and we had lots of taxpayers come forward with this issue, and I probably right around the time the white paper was written.
Sorry, John. You're up.
No worries at all. I got a few thoughts. I think I've got one question buried in here, but I just want to offer up some thoughts that are responsive to Attorney Ferrini's testimony, if that's okay with the chair. I guess the first is, I think the question around assessing practices. I think the attorney does raise some interesting questions that might be worth pursuing, outside of the context of this commission. But to the extent we're gonna agree as a commission to continue to rely principally or materially, at the very least, on the property tax, I think it makes sense to always try to figure ways to make it a more fair and equitably administered tax. And I think the attorney raises a couple valid points around access to commercial data for the purpose of not only assessing in the first place, but defending the city or town as it may be against appeals. I think that makes a lot of sense. I would personally advocate for assessors either to be able to enter properties or to limit appeals if that access is denied. I had my property in Hopkinton revaled outside of the normal cycle, in part because I bought the property and the listing noted how wonderful my kitchen and baths were. My kitchen and baths are not wonderful. And so I invited the assessor into my house to see, And the assessor agreed with me. But assessors have to do these things because they don't have access to the houses. And as somebody who watches the real estate market just as a hobby, you see it all the time where a house is assessed, say, at $300,000, and on the surface, that makes a lot of sense, half-acre parcel, 2,000 square feet. But then the real estate listing goes up and you're like, custom kitchen, custom baths, it's on sale for 400,000 and it's probably going to get it. But it's assessed at 300 because the assessor's never been inside. So those are real issues, probably outside of the scope of this commission, but I think that's worth following up as if you're a legislator who wants to dig into a real difficult matter. I think the attorney put out a lot of data, demographic data, but I think a lot of it was lacking in context. I think the most important point when thinking about property taxes in Portsmouth, city of Portsmouth, is that Portsmouth's full value tax rate of 13.43 in 2019 was 37th lowest of 226 taxing jurisdictions in the state. So that's in the 16th percentile. And I bet if you weighted that by population, that I would be able to say, I haven't done the math, but I think if I weighted it by population, I would be able to say 90+% of property taxpayers in the state of New Hampshire pay a higher rate per $1,000 of value than the property taxpayers in Portsmouth. Attorney Ferrini, would you agree that that's a valid assessment?
I don't have all the statistics available in that way, but I trust you as a former revenue administrator to be accurate on the math. But certainly the tax rate is very good in Portsmouth. I was speaking not so much. You have all that data about where Portsmouth falls and what its swept rate is, but my perspective was, why do people not like property tax? What are the issues that upset folks? I leave it to all your prior folks who've given you wonderful data about where Portsmouth falls in the grand scheme of things. So I know that we have a relatively low tax rate compared to many other communities. I'm not implying by my testimony that we don't. My charge, as I saw it, was to try to talk through what folks feel, and what they're not just in Portsmouth per se, but what property tax, how it impacts Portsmouth, but in a more broader sense.
That's fair, and I appreciate your advocacy on behalf of the people in Portsmouth. That's your job. I just think, if we're gonna think about the burdens of the property tax, the Portsmouth perspective is less burdened than perhaps the Franklin perspective, which is the 121st lowest. So kind of right in the middle.
Absolutely. I'm not, and I hope I didn't give the impression that I'm coming to you with tears in my eyes. No, I just had a very sort of generic, as I said before, what I was trying to describe is sort of this whole commercial piece, which I don't think it's something that the commission has considered. I think it's something for outside this commission, but it is in the mind of any property taxpayer, not just Portsmouth, but any residential taxpayer.
Sure, but I would submit that my town and perhaps the city of Franklin would love to have the diversity of property that the city of Portsmouth has. We've got committees that think about this all the time.
Of course.
Mostly in vain. I guess the other question is, were you suggesting that Portsmouth is a more elderly city than New Hampshire as a whole? Again, it sort of lacked the context. And
yeah, I don't think our numbers. I don't know the statewide number on that. I'm sure I can get that to you. I just personally was surprised. I mean, I live in Portsmouth. I've lived here for many decades. I just had no idea. And I thought it was interesting to share because I know in observing the past commission, this is something the commission has touched on. You know, what's our population look like? Who is paying our taxes? Who is paying the property tax? And I just found that interesting as far as statistics.
Sure, because I looked it up real quick while you were chatting, and if you look at ratio of 65 plus, Portsmouth's actually below the state average. Franklin's above it.
What is the state average?
18.7%. Portsmouth's at 18.1, Franklin's at 19.3. So not materially different.
Not totally different. Yeah.
And I guess, you know, you raise another issue about the meals and rooms tax, which Portsmouth has long advocated for a higher share of the distribution from the state, which would deprive other towns, all things being equal, or the ability to separately tax that industry. I'm not necessarily opposed to developing other levers for cities and towns to pull. And I think you might have teed up in a positive way for this committee to talk about, you know, if we're going to rely on the property tax, or we're going to have a property tax that's unlimited as to rate and amount, how can we incentivize local governments, school districts to otherwise raise money and to rely less on the property tax? Portsmouth's go-to is the restaurant industry, not surprising. That's not as meaningful in Hopkinton, where I live. It's probably even less meaningful in Deering or even more rural towns nearby me, but there are other ways to raise money. Taxing motor vehicles, for example, is a state regulated process, and I've not studied it, but I would imagine the ratio of nice cars to crummy cars is sort of similar across the state. But, you know, we may want to talk a little bit more about how else can we steer the burden away from the local property tax. I'd be very much willing to be a part of that conversation.
That's a very interesting point. Yeah, I think that's an excellent thing to consider.
Thank you. That's all I got, Dave.
All right. No, thanks, Don. I see Chris had put her hand up, but I just want to check to see if there's anybody else that has a burning question right now. Let me go to Dick for a second, and then you, Chris. You're muted, Dick.
Working on it. I got it. Sorry. Not really a burning question, but a fundamental question, I guess. So you said that the people believe that the statewide property tax is really not a statewide tax. It's a local tax. At least that's the feeling, that it is a local tax. And,
certainly historically. Certainly historically.
Okay. So why would that be? What is it about this tax that is levied by the state, that's calculated by the state, that's uniform across municipal boundaries, that differentiates it in the sense that you've articulated from so many other taxes that are collected by the state or the federal government, for that matter? If you look back up a step on the income tax, which is collected across the country, and some places like New York City pay much more than they get back. I think New Hampshire does too. And it's, you know, occasionally brought up, but the differential between the amount collected and the amount received, other than being sort of something that people throw off as a gripe or something they're proud of, it really doesn't go anywhere. And here we have the statewide property tax that somehow has gotten into this place where donor towns are identified. You speak of Portsmouth sending the tax money to the state. It's really the Portsmouth taxpayer, who's a New Hampshire taxpayer, who's paying indirectly into the state treasury. How does it become a local tax? Could you speak to that and why, whether that's a fear or a belief or?
I think it's a belief. I think it's, I'm not sure it's universally held, but certainly in the information early on this issue, the information that circulated by the former donor towns, that was very much an issue that was part of the fuel to repeal the statewide education property tax, because it was, again, it was perceived as a local tax with raised for local purposes to educate local children. I am not a tax expert, and I understand the analysis that you have just discussed, but I think it's feeling. I think it's again, like I said before, the question is, why didn't it work last time? And what were some of the reasons why SWIFT is an issue? And I offered that as one of the reasons why I feel people are and were reluctant to think of SWIFT as a statewide tax and more as a local tax. It's locally assessed, it's locally administered, it's locally retained.
Great.
Thanks.
Are you all set, Dick? Chris?
Well, and to Dick's
And then
point, I would
Bill.
also say, because it's based on a local property value and because there are no state controls on it. So originally there was no sense that the state will tell X community what to do with this money. It doesn't pay for anything, quote, particular. So I think it's really hard to distinguish it. But I was going to follow up on John's point. It's in this line of all these ancillary issues that may not be this commission's issues,
Right.
but that sort of make it better or worse in whatever decisions we end up making. I was the Portsmouth rep to the Municipal Association Board and really worked for like 10 years on trying to advocate for this opportunity for local communities to be able to have some say over what they might tax. And whether, it was restaurant seats in our case or pillow tax or whatever. In the last, quote, Congress where the Municipal Association determines legislation, 3/4 of the communities voted to put that legislation forth. So to John, your point, many communities could see some option for themselves. It wouldn't be what we would do in Portsmouth, but the communities often that you might not think would benefit, actually would benefit more, because a very small community that had a resort hotel or something could see that its benefit would be more than, relatively what we might even get in Portsmouth. So we over a period of time could see, and I do think the increase on property taxes was part of the reason, that more and more communities wanted this option for themselves, and they could figure out some way to do some balancing out of property tax.
Can I just respond to that, Dave?
Yeah, sure thing, John.
Thanks for sharing that, and that's really interesting. And I guess I'm not surprised that 3/4 of municipalities would want. What was the proposal, to authorize a hotel or a lodge or a restaurant tax?
Local option. It was local option to be able to it wasn't it was an open local option that you had the option to identify something with the will of your local voters, whatever your governance structure was. So it wasn't particularly to hotel or to whatever. They could have come up with some other way to do it.
That makes a lot of sense to me, but I would worry that if we went down that path, 5-10 years later, you'd look and see Portsmouth's really captured the restaurant and lodging economic benefit. Its property tax rate is even lower. and Hopkinton's taxing the 3 restaurants we've got in town, and our property tax rate is higher.
Yeah.
You know, Portsmouth really does have a rich property tax. That's not the right word, but it's a nice property tax base in many ways.
Right.
It's commercial, it's waterfront, it's
Right.
it's high, it's you know it's an outlier is what it is. There's not a lot of
Well,
cities.
But you know, it was interesting over time, the Lincolns, the Conways, the Albanys, the many others could see some value. I don't by any means say this is the route to equalization, but this is the route to some of the things Jane was talking about, having property tax owners feel maybe a little less burdened, particularly when the residential property tax owner is a small portion of the tax base.
No, that's fair.
If I could add just that, one of the interesting communities was West Lebanon, or up Lebanon, I think. They had put in some hotels they fund for, I think, maybe it was a convention center and a hotel, but there was some issue, I believe, with the sewer and the water with the particular structure, and they support, you know, Hanover and the hospital and all of that, and so you wouldn't. They don't have the mountain and the lake and the ocean, but they were a community that was very interested in this because of, you know, supporting the infrastructure for their that particular hotel, not so much for leisure purposes, but I think for supporting the local businesses and the hospital. So that was just another example of a community that realized over time that might be something worthwhile. Just to add to the conversation.
Great. Thanks, Jane and John and Chris, for that. Bill.
Yes, thank you. I had one follow-up on Dick's question and one question. And thank you, Jane, attorney, for your presentation. Appreciate you bringing it here. The question about the way people feel, you know, and oftentimes the way they feel is not backed up by facts or data. They just feel it. Would it change their feeling, in your view, as someone who's on the ground, who's been there in history, if we were to, if the state were to say, this state property tax, this swept, the way we've done it, we're going to change it. We're going to have the tax collected as a separate state tax, and it's going to be paid into an account at the state treasurer's office. And it's all across the state. Taxpayers pay it into that account, and it builds up just like other taxes, like meals and rooms, like transfer tax. It adds up, and then out of that account, the state legislature passes a budget that distributes that money out to communities for use in public education based on an assessment of need and outcomes and capacity. Do you think if taxpayers were writing a check that they knew was a state tax, it's going into a state account, and then, as you know from the Sorrell decision, the lower court in that case said, yeah, once it's in a state account, that's it. Now you can spend it any way the legislature deems fit, you know, subject to basic limitations. Would that change their feeling in your judgment?
It might, but I'm not sure. I completely understand what you're saying. And it may for some and it may not for others. And I hate to give such an evasive answer, but
That's okay.
But I think those with the long history on it, you know, and the long view of it may not change their mind. Perhaps newer folks to this, I don't know. But it's an idea, but I just can't opine on it.
I appreciate that. And my second question relates to your discussion about abatements. You've got, you know, imagine a hypothetical where you have a person who's lived in Portsmouth for a long time. Their kids went to Portsmouth schools, but now they're elderly. Their income is fixed, but the home they're living in, let's just say, because of the changes we've experienced in Portsmouth, which are so phenomenal, unlike in Berlin, that the value of the home that they live in is now worth $1 million. That elderly person is one of the wealthiest humans on the face of the planet in terms of net worth. You think that it is appropriate if you were to grant an abatement, which is a full exception, you never owe that tax. You think it might be appropriate to consider rather recognizing that the real problem there is that the person doesn't have current cash flow. And maybe what you do is you defer the payment of property tax until the person gets to an event like selling the home, in which case that deferred property tax would be paid. Because remember, providing an abatement to an elderly person whose children have gone to the schools and benefited from Portsmouth, and they actually are one of the wealthiest people in the world because their home value, which is an asset, it's not very progressive. And the question is really, should Portsmouth consider a deferral mechanism, and should this commission consider a deferral mechanism rather than an all-out abatement in that type of situation? Thank you.
I think that is a very interesting concept. That decision obviously would be made by city councilor with advice of assessors and tax folks. But I think for purposes of this commission in looking at relief to property owners, it's a concept that is something to look at.
Thank you very much for your coming to testify.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Bill. Chris.
Well, we already have that. You know, I'm speaking now as a former elected official in Portsmouth because I've had that conversation with quite a few elderly people. We have that possibility through liens. You know, call it a lien, call it an abatement. There's just I think there's a historical really reluctance of people to accept that option because obviously you recoup the taxes later, and you know, in many cases it's the inability to say, well, you know, I don't want to deprive my family of that. And it's you know, I always used to say that if more people in New Hampshire had taken Algebra 2, we wouldn't have these problems. But because you've got to deal with a number of the variables at the same time and deal with that, I have not found people willing to take us up on that because, you know, certainly as a city, and there even been some city councilors who were in that situation when I first served, and they wouldn't accept that option. And so I think as a state, we'd have to find some ways. You know, I've looked at this in other areas. I was involved in Philadelphia for a while, where people were losing their homes over the inability to pay, you know, another $500. And the unwillingness of people to, culturally, historically, whatever, to accept this abatement, lien, whatever, I've always run up against.
Could I just follow?
Yeah, go ahead, Bill.
Really briefly.
Yeah.
Chris, I hear you, and in my experience in tax policy, I've really never found a taxpayer who chooses, oh, I'd rather pay the tax over not, or getting defer the tax rather than paying an abatement. They are interested in preserving their wealth for their own family. Every taxpayer is in the same exact boat, but I think that there is no real option for deferral now. The lien option you're presenting is not viable because it's not thoughtful. Other states, Dave had asked me to look, I'm starting to compile it, have thought more carefully. The interest rate is outrageous. The collection process must move ahead. And so therefore we haven't examined that option here. And I think all you're left with is that some, not all, but some, you know, very wealthy elderly taxpayers are able to say, I would like to not support public schools anymore. And I think I think that they should be given a different option because, in my view, and I'm going to work on that. But anyways.
No, thank you very much, Bill. We're going to have to pivot in a second, but a couple of really important points. I think Jane hit on it. I think Bill really, sort of posed the question and laid it out. But yeah, I mean, you just said it, that there are some people that really don't understand, and whether it's related to whether or not they have children or how old they are, I don't know, about, questioning whether or not their dollars should go to support public schools. But I think, what you're saying, Bill, is a really important point, that public education is in the public interest. And we certainly want to find ways that people, regardless of their financial status, can or cash flow status or whatever, can participate in that public interest, in supporting that public interest. And thanks for taking on, I think, it's sort of a technically, I think, complicated project along those lines. And I just wanted to note, that we've probably seen these ads on TV, but someone very, very conservative is running for executive council, and he talks about the importance of New Hampshire students receiving the best education, receiving top quality education. So public education is in the public interest, and I think it is part of this commission's effort to find practical ways where everybody can participate in that goal. So Jane, I want to thank you very much for your time this morning, and hopefully can you hang on with us?
I don't think I can this morning, but I usually catch you once a little bit later on if I just catch the commission meetings, and then I always bother Chris Dwyer if I've missed something.
Okay. Well, we're going to again extend our thanks, and we will see you as an attendee on future meetings. If you can hang with us this morning, great. But we're going to turn to Paul Grenier, who's the mayor in Berlin, New Hampshire. And Paul, very much like Jane, spent a lot of time traveling between Berlin and the LOB in Concord during our school funding bills this past session. And obviously, Berlin has a unique set of challenges, and as do I think so many cities and towns across the state. The AIR study really sort of bears that out, that the cost of public education is not a one size fits all, taking Jane's term. It's not the same in Berlin as it is in Hopkinton, as it is in Portsmouth. And the AIR report helps to bear that out. But I just wanted to introduce Mr. Mayor Paul Grenier, and to talk a little bit about what's going on the ground in Berlin, but also the effect of property taxes on the ability of the city of Berlin to do well by its students and families, and at the same time, take care of all the municipal services that it needs to provide there as well. So
I have to bow out. I'm sorry, and I'm sorry to miss this, but I wanted to thank you all for your time, and I have been tracking what you've been doing. You've been doing an absolutely fantastic job. It is incredibly complex work, and I want to thank you all as a New Hampshire resident, and keep up the good work. It is not an easy task, But if you have any questions for me, or if there's anything else I can do for you folks, don't hesitate to reach out. So thanks so much.
Great. Thank you, Jane. So, Mr. Mayor, thank you for joining us this morning, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Representative Luneau. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'll kind of give you a little brief history of where we are and where we hope to go. I think Berlin's issues in funding education really started in 1970. As you may or may not know, in 1970, the mills were in full operation. And the mills at that time paid 53% of the Berlin's property taxes. And with Smith Hydro and Public Service Company's other properties, they were in for another 23% of the city's property taxes. So the residents were in for about 22 or 23% of the city's property tax bills. So, our schools were really a superior school system. Our infrastructure was in superior shape. And then the legislature changed the tax structure. They eliminated the stock and trade tax and instituted the business profits tax and the BET. And for the loss of revenue that the city saw from no longer being able to tax machinery, the legislature threw a bone at the city and gave us $200,000 for 5 or 6 years until that went away. And that really was, in hindsight, the beginning of the end as far as property wealth in the community. And going back, fast forwarding to today, Berlin's gross property tax valuation is about $420 million, of which 37 to 38% is utility properties. Now, utilities don't pay school tax. So now you can get to see how this is all shaping out. We had a statistical update to our properties 2 years ago, and we went from 110% equalization rate to a 95% equalization rate. So, the utilities get updated every single year. So they jumped at the opportunity to scoff up 20% of value. So they took the city to court, Public Service Company, and a successor, Central Rivers, on Smith Hydro, and the city had them valued at $50.5 million, and they argued for a $49 million value successfully, which $1.5 million of value is not at all painful. But when you lose the equalization rate, which the BTLA in the last 3 or 4 utility decisions has given the utilities the present equalization rate and not the equalization rate of when they filed. So now we're forced to pay, repay valuation on, $7 million only because of the equalization rate. And I don't think that that's correct. Everybody else in the community is paying taxes on 110% equalization rate. Why should the utilities, only because they get updated every year, get that benefit because they have a house full of attorneys? So that's the one big problem that I see that needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed, in this legislative session. And quite frankly, the legislature was somewhat kind to Berlin as far as one-time funding, but I've kind of put everybody on notice here. The tsunami's coming, and we really have to prepare ourselves for the worst-case scenario because of lost revenue to the state. The state, in turn, has lost revenue to the communities. It looks to me like there's going to be a lot more pain coming down to the community here next year. This year, we've done a lot of one-time expenses as far as capital work that we've really deferred because to the extent possible, the city of Berlin has prioritized education funding, and it's done so to the detriment of our public works department, our fire department, and municipal infrastructure. So here we are, we're struggling. It's a great place to live and it's a struggle, but with a $38, $39 tax rate, how do you attract new property investment? That's the $1 million question. My home, I've got a really nice home, but it's not valued a lot. So my tax bill isn't huge. And most people feel that same way. I mean, their tax bills aren't, crazy money. But if you do a huge home improvement or if you build a new house, you're paying through the nose. So that's kind of what comes first, the chicken or the egg? We're not seeing new investment because of that.
Paul, thanks very much for that. Something that hadn't jumped out at me until you mentioned it is the portion of the valuation, 37% attributed to utilities. And I'm looking at the DRA tax comp from FY19, and so I'm looking at Berlin. I see that. I can look down at Bow, just 4 lines down, and their total valuation is 1.3 billion. If you net out utilities, it's 1.2 billion. So it's almost the same. Obviously, a lot higher than Berlin's total
right.
valuation. But what's the situation in Berlin what's and Bow's got Merrimack Station there, so there is a power station there. But what's the infrastructure in Berlin that puts so much utility valuation?
Well, we have all of the former paper mill water generators that are now owned by Brookfield. They own 3 facilities within the borders of Berlin, and then J. Brody Smith Hydro Station, which was previously owned by Eversource and now Central Rivers, they're part of the equation. We have a 18 megawatt wind farm here in town, and so when you add up and then we have Burgess Biopower. So when you add up all of that value in town, that's 37% of our property values in utility. Mm-hmm. And we're beginning discussions with a utility on a battery farm, which is all fine and good. But, the problem with these guys is they kind of have you over a barrel. And whenever they don't like their value or whenever they see a discrepancy in equalization, they slam you. We spend, on average, we spend $150,000 a year in legal and expert fees just defending utility values when we lose maybe $1 million or $2 million a year in value. Because they're going after the EQ rate. They're not going after the value.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Just to be clear, the utilities do pay the local portion of ed taxes. They just don't pay the state education property tax, and which of course in every community the SWEPT or the state property tax is collected locally, and every penny of it remains local, under current law. So so you get none of that state property tax borne on the utilities. Utilities do pay a separate $6.60 per thousand property tax, which goes to the state, which actually goes to the Education Trust Fund, and Berlin obviously gets a portion out of that. But probably not in proportion to the the $1.93 state property tax versus the 660.
We figured it out, and we're still ahead in the current system.
Oh yeah, yeah.
You know, we're in the middle of a revaluation, and one of the small miracles here in Berlin is that we've been discovered by folks who come from outside the area, who have vacationed here with ATVs and hiking and fishing. And a lot of the property, single and two-family homes here, sales have been quite brisk. And these people are buying these places, you know, a lot of times for a joke compared to where they're coming from in Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts, and they're renovating them. And they're using them as vacation homes and with plans on retiring here. So, you know, it's not all doom and gloom here. We just need a ladder to get ourselves 10 years from now so that we're in pretty good shape. But, you know, we're resourceful here, I got to tell you, and we work together. There's not a lot of infighting in Berlin as far as funding for education, because everyone knows that the best and brightest are probably not going to stay here, or a good portion of them probably won't stay here. So we got to give them a really good education so that they can find their way in life. You know, my goal would be to keep most of these smart kids. You know, I'm one of the lucky few parents where my son's a civil engineer and he decided to stay in Berlin, but that's not the norm. That's the exception. And we really need, and I think this is a state problem. I really think that we need to keep our best and brightest here in New Hampshire. You know, the North Country is still a very special place to live. It's a struggle to make ends meet, but if you can make ends meet, there's nothing like it up here.
Dick, Paul, will you take some questions from?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, great. Dick, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for joining us and sharing your experiences and wisdom. You made a reference to something I wasn't sure I understood. I think I have an idea what it's about, but you mentioned one-time funding, and you said the legislature has been generous on that, but it's probably there'll be an issue coming up because it will not be maintained, or that's a forecast, a possibility. So could you lay that out a little bit more, what we're talking about here?
In the last legislature, they restored some school funding for catastrophic aid and some other portions of aid. And then in the second year of the biennium, you know, Berlin got $2 million of one-time funding, you know, for education. And, you know, we use that for the schools needed a lot of infrastructure work that we did not build that into our operations. We built that into infrastructure expenses because it wasn't a guaranteed flow of money. So we didn't want to put ourselves in a situation where, you know, you spend money on stuff that you'd like to have versus what you need, and then you can't fund the stuff that you'd like to have a year or two down the road. So we've had to take a conservative approach to you know, to fund our community. And we gave the property taxpayers a little bit of relief too, so that, you know, we could share in the benefit all the way around.
Good. That's what I thought you were referring to. I think it's very important to bring out that aspect of the fiscal year 21 funding that the state's providing, that there is that piece that was identified and is a one-time commitment, but no more than that. So thank you.
Yeah, I would be thrilled to death if we got 5 years of that commitment. It would take, you know, we would essentially be caught up infrastructure wise, and we'd be in a situation where we wouldn't be so dependent. But, when, the legislature back, I believe it was in 2012, when they started reducing school funding by 2% a year, or 5% a year. I mean, that was devastating because, the community kept funding the difference, kept funding the loss, kept funding the loss. And if you don't raise taxes, you got to take it from some other department, or you got to deplete your undesignated fund balance. And, Berlin has a tax warrant of about $15-16 million. We've got a budget of about 40 when you count debt service and county tax. But we have a warrant of about 15 to 16 million, and our undesignated fund balance is about 1.3 million. So it's not a huge undesignated fund balance on the size warrant that we have. So we can't afford to make a mistake, that's for sure.
Mhm. Further questions for Paul?
In closing, I guess I don't like to be the poster child of a community that's struggling, because we're a very proud people here, and we work hard, and we love our families, and we love our community. And I think this is a situation where, I hope that the commission can find an equitable way of funding education. We're not looking for a handout. We're looking for fairness.
Great. Thanks very much, Paul. And thanks for joining us today. And I hope I know you've been very involved in all of our, discussions about school funding, and we welcome that involvement and commitment.
Well, I'll continue to help whenever I can and whenever I'm asked. It's a pleasure. It really is.
Dave, can I just say something?
Yes.
I want to say, Paul, thank you for coming, and you represent your community very well. And when I was a kid going to Stevens High School, I used to love coming up and playing baseball underneath the mills in town there against the great Berlin High School teams. It was very fun. You do a great job for your community, so thank you.
Well, I'm class of 73, so, we had some great hockey teams, and we had a football program back then, too. We weren't pushovers.
I remember.
No,
Thank
that's
you.
I should tell people that that's when my former father-in-law, Larry Dwyer, was superintendent in Berlin.
Yes. I remember Mr. Dwyer. Remember very well. In fact, he was superintendent when I was going to school.
Uh-oh.
Well, all right. Well, on that note, Paul, you're welcome to hang with us. We're going to, I think, shift gears and talk a little bit about what we've heard so far from our research consultants at AIR, and also a little bit about the simulator that they've provided to us, and I believe is available on the is it on the commission website?
It is, yes.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So Jordan, what were the specific things we wanted to sort of chat about on this?
Before
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, I've got a scoop, but I want to thank you for the opportunity, and I am keeping a close eye. I want to thank the commission for recording its meeting so that I can check them out late at night when there's no hockey on TV. Thank you.
If you don't mind, how is school reopening going in Berlin?
Well, we've just we hired Train as a consultant to check our HVAC units, and our high school. We got a report where the HVAC unit is not running at 100% capacity and needs some work. So we were slated to open K through 3 5 days a week, and the other school's 3 days a week with 2 days of remote learning. But this may delay full reopening for a week or two until we get to the bottom of it. The superintendent actually emailed me last evening to give me an update. It's nothing serious, but you know, there's some things that have to be done so that everybody's comfortable with being in class. But we're ready to go. You know, our Board of Education has done a fantastic job. We do a lot with less. It's incredible. Watch these people do what they do, and they bring their heart to the table. They don't bring personal agendas to the table. They bring heart to the table. Boy, what a difference that makes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, we certainly saw that in the Education Committee, you know, this past session with your students and former students that came and testified to the quality education that you have in Berlin. Of course, Dr. Cascadden's a member of this commission too.
Yes.
And shares a lot of you know, her experience from them.
I'm sure she keeps you straight.
Always has. So thanks so much, Mr.
Appreciate it.
Great. We will see you soon.
Take care.
All right. Thanks. So Jordan, we wanted to talk a little bit about what we've seen from AIR.
Yeah, we wanted to make sure, you know, folks had a little bit more space. You know, we digested a lot of information last week about the simulator. Hopefully some folks have had some time to look at it, play around with it a little bit, just start to get some initial thoughts and where that fits in with the fiscal policy. And as we start to head down this road towards thinking about what the possible, you know, suite of recommendations might be, you know, just give space for people to talk about that and to, you know, to just some open discussion time, not just presentations. So I think that was the main thing. Right.
No, thanks, Jordan. I think one of the things the AIR simulation tool shows us too is that public education, it can be, you know, it can be both a state as well as a local responsibility, and you can see that in the simulator model that you can sort of create, you know, really sort of shift that responsibility from one side to the other at various levels. And so it hopefully provides us with a lot of flexibility in terms of helping understand how possible fiscal policy would impact could impact public education funding. Has everybody had a chance to try the simulator a little bit? So any sort of anybody want to share some initial thoughts on that, and in particular, if there's anything we want to ask of our consultants before they sort of wrap up their final report, this would be an important time to do that. So Chris, I saw your hand up.
Just some early thoughts. I can't say I've digested yet what everything that is possible there. And some of this comes from looking at the distributions across communities of how the weights play out. And one thing that struck me is this notion that we talked about earlier on of concentration. And when you look at, for example, English learner weights, with the exception of like 4 or 5 communities in our state, the proportion of English learners is very minimal, and but those 4 or 5 places where concentration occurs really need that extra support. And so I'm compelled by the way Maine did their formula, where they did ELLs by a concentration approach instead of like dribbling a little bit of money out for everybody. That was one thing that I looked at. A second thing came up this morning already. It really feels to me like transportation needs to be categorical and not part of the formula. It's a substantial cost, but it plays out so variably. And as I think Jane said this morning, we have no idea going forward with remoteness or hybrid learning or combinations, kind of how some of this is going to play out. So I certainly believe that transportation is an important cost to consider, but it feels by formula. Special ed, as we talked about at our last meeting, the variable costs within special ed, since the weight is so high, really feel like that's work to be done and to figure out how to look at special education, because the distribution across the state in terms of percentages isn't that wide, but there's some real outliers. And this is a place where you have to put your trust in the local districts that there's some level of comparability in terms of what people are calling special needs. And so that bears a lot more tinkering and looking at and thinking about. And I come at the same thing with poverty, and I've taught in a few of the most high poverty districts in the distribution of communities. And it feels there that if we could pay attention more somehow to concentration, as opposed to, again, just looking at it as if it's a continuum. I don't want to lose this notion of concentration as we have now a continuum for all of those different percentages for each of the weights.
So thanks, Chris, and I want to just follow up on the concentration piece a little bit, because I'm not sure I understand it. So let's use the example of English language learners, which I think you use that as an example, that sort of, fall into Manchester, Concord, Nashua, maybe not so much in other places. I mean, maybe some in Portsmouth. But aren't those the schools that would be getting the additional weighted aid? Other school districts really wouldn't be benefiting from that EL weight, right?
Well, if you had 2%, let's say you have 2% English learners, the way I interpreted the weights is that you would get some for 2%, right? And what I'm saying is, I don't know why we need, we have 4% in Portsmouth. I'm not sure we need extra dollars for our English learners when we're at that small a percentage, but I know that Manchester at 9 or 10% really does. Because if you look across the state, it's sort of like, why would you even spread the money that you had to 1% in 100 communities when there are 4 communities that have high concentration? And I'm assuming that was the logic behind why Maine chose to do ELL funding by concentration and not by part of an amount per pupil.
So when you do it by concentration, would you?
You mean by like a categorical?
Yeah, that's what I was.
Essentially categorical.
Yeah, so not part of the
ELL is categorical. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
They didn't call it that, but yes.
Understood.
Yeah. So at Jay's meeting this afternoon, I think there's going to be some more discussion on that. So I hope we get some notes on that. I saw some other, Dick.
Yeah, a lot of what we're talking about now is really the formula for weighting kids. It's really the adequacy determination, which I think Jay's group is going to be looking at. You just mentioned that. But one thing that I noticed I hadn't thought of until recently was the the cooperative school districts as a good example, where you've got multiple towns feeding into one school district. So my own place is Jaffrey, and it's Jaffrey Ringe. It's a simple cooperative school district to think about. And if you look at the per student adequacy figure or formula figure that's simulated, you'll find that Jaffrey's need, which is what this reflects, is a couple of $1,000s per pupil higher than Ringe's need. And that's a taxpayer equity number, I think. It's not, clearly can't be, an educational equity difference, because Jaffrey student goes to the same place as Ringe student, and they get the same education there. So the number that counts for them is the in-between. It's the total amount of money that goes to the Jaffrey Ringe district divided by the total number of kids that are there, which is more like somewhere in the middle, about 2,000. And I just bring this up because I think it should be somewhere in the data that AIR brings forward for all the cooperative school districts, so that we can see what's real in terms of education costs, but still keep our attention on what the taxpayers in these multiple towns are feeling in terms of the burden and effort that's being asked of them to in this system that we have. So just a comment, I think information that allowed that separate viewing and analysis and thought process would be useful.
So thanks, Dick. And I want to comment on that real quick, because when I was looking at the model, I didn't get the impression that the cost model, so the calculated, simulated cost, had anything to do with taxpayer equity. That was really on the other side of the model, the examples that they showed in terms of how that cost could be paid for. But maybe I'm completely wrong.
Well, I think, the printout on this, the simulator is one thing. What's printed out as information is another thing. But the printout shows, after you have all these columns, it shows you get to a point of the formula cost for the town. And now we're at the town level. That's what this has been translated from districts to town. And that's what we're looking at. Mm-hmm. And so we've got a total formula cost for the town, and then that's divided by the number of students that come from that town. Right. And you got a number there. What good is that? What's that number represent other than the amount that town is going to be attributed to that town, in part from however we come up with our revenue, who's going to pay for what, is going to add up to $17,000 per kid from that town. And it's going to be made up maybe 100%, because we're talking about adequacy now, by state dollars in one form or another, or it's going to have some local aspect to it if we take a different approach, and a state aspect, but it's all going to add up to a certain amount of money. It's going to be an indicator of the need for tax revenues. That's why I thought of it as more of a tax number than an education number.
Yeah.
Dave, could I chime in on that?
Yeah, go ahead, Bill. Thanks.
This is, I think Dick has got his finger on a very important issue, and I've been struggling with this, Dick. That there, and I had an exchange with Drew Atkinson a little bit. I'm not going to be at today's adequacy meeting, which I'm really upset about, but I got messed up on my schedule. So those numbers, Dick, as I understand it, the 17,000 for Jaffrey and the 15,000 for Ringe and the 20,000 for Manchester, those numbers, those total spend numbers, are really the product of two things. There's a first regression model that focuses on outcomes and tries to develop a sense of what is necessary to be spent in a particular community to achieve a state average outcome. And in that particular sense, there is no tax equity component in there. So what Dave says is right up to that point. But then once those relationships are established among the different communities in terms of that per pupil number, which is outcomes translated to value, you enter the second regression model, which is the simulated model that we're looking at. And you're right, the weighting columns all get to those numbers, but that simulated column has a relationship to the first effort. And I think, Dave, I'm working really hard to understand this. And Drew has done an admirable job of trying to help me, but I'm struggling with it because I like the relationships that are the outcome-based relationships that are coming out, that are showing that Manchester has higher need in terms of spending to achieve a particular targeted outcome. But we don't have that model before us. That hasn't been given to us. That is part of the AIR system, and it's complicated, I would bet. And beyond my capacity, certainly, with the limited amount of statistical, training that I have. But I think I'm worried that in the adequacy group, we're going to start really working on those weightings, but really the relationship that we're focused on, which is what Dick focuses on, the difference between Jaffrey and Ringe are based on an estimate of what is necessary to achieve a common outcome, a targeted outcome. And I think we don't have that in front of us. So you can't touch it with your hands in a model because it's, number one, it probably exceeds our ability. Any individual, maybe not Chris. Chris has some statistical capacity I've seen that she could probably do it. Or maybe Luneau from MIT can do it. But I'm struggling with it. And I think it's important for us to know that. And that was my comment for the adequacy group. I just think we gotta really tie into where those relationships among communities are coming from. Because Dick, they're not coming from tax equity. That's my understanding.
Right. No. Thanks, Bill. And I think it's going to be important for the commission, and certainly the adequacy group and the commission to really understand how those numbers were arrived at, and Drew's been enormously helpful on that. But Dick raises an important point too with and I know we're going to wrap up in a few minutes, but with regards to co-ops, and let's stay with Jaffrey Ringe. So it's possible that Jaffrey Ringe could have an agreement to split costs based on their student enrollment. Is that right?
The answer is legally. The answer is yes.
That's what I mean. So legally, right.
No, it's both. I believe it's both population and property value per pupil. I think.
Okay. So now, how does that tie back to what the calculated cost is, and what gets contributed from Jaffrey and from Ringe to the co-op? Because what's in their co-op agreement could be very different than what came out of the calculated cost. Is that sort of?
Well, yeah, I don't know whether we want to get into the co-op allocations. I was more interested in the per pupil costs that were being displayed, and really in the issue that Bill was getting to. And I just underscore what he said. We have to understand as we go forward with this where these weightings came from and how they're put in monetized. And I don't we're dealing with the next step, which is the simulator we have. We don't have the original calculation as I see it. We don't know the outputs, how they measured the outputs. I haven't seen anything. But
No, it may be, Dick, that it's proprietary or it's a special thing. But at the end of the day, if the commission were to recommend something along those lines, it would have to ultimately be translatable into legislative text. And that means we really need to know it. And I see Jay, I'm sorry I'll miss our meeting today, Mr. Chair, but that was my concern for the meeting. Before we really wrangle about weightings, there is this core issue, which is the fundamental relationship among communities based on outcome that I think is still, it is clear they presented it, but I'm struggling with it.
Yeah. So just to, to be clear on what we need to do or what could be done legislatively, our legislation's currently based on weights. I mean, it's weights turned into dollars. That's ultimately, I think, what goes into the RSA, not necessarily the regression process of getting to that. Other than, and I think Jay's pointed out that we do have an outcome-driven section in our statutes, and that probably should reflect what outcomes were used when looking across all the cities and towns and school districts in the state to measure the cost of those outcomes.
Can I just, Dave, on that?
Yeah.
At some point, a representative of a community like Wolfboro, which has 14,000 per pupil, will want to say, hey, where'd you come up with the 14 as opposed to the Manchester 21? And the answer is not in the weightings. The answer is
right.
Well,
no, I was just
started with the measurement, and to some extent they need to see, and so does the Supreme Court ultimately if it gets there, to see that, and it's got to be clear and it's got to be a direct tie. Right now, those relationships, you can't get it by just starting with a blank slate of weights.
No, right, Bill, I agree with you completely. All I was getting at is we're not going to need that explanation to go into the statutes. The weights go into the statutes, but we need this legislation we need this understanding to help move forward any possible legislation.
I agree. Exactly.
So I think what Bill, you're asking for is you want to see what were the actual outcomes, right? I mean, if all of this is being driven by proficiency rates at 3rd, 8th, and SAT scores, then you want to be able to look and say, okay, there's the evidence. Wolfboro's got 3rd grade proficiencies that are 2 times what a low income community's proficiency rate is at 3rd grade, right? And the model, because it's trying to aim to the statistical average of the state, is going to say, well, Wolfboro, you don't need to spend as much unless you really want 80% of your students at proficiency. But somebody who clearly doesn't reach 50% proficiency rates at 3rd grade, they need help. They need help because they're not generating enough resources to lift that number for the conditions in that district. So that's what the weights are. If we need to see some of the more raw statistics, it's all driven off of that. So I think we can get that for you. We ought to.
I think that what you're saying is, if we say to the public, and I'm not saying if the legislative process says it's all based on the output analysis, and then they say, well, where is the outcome stuff in your legislation? Well, trust us, this curve was developed in a separate effort. I just think it can't, right now, if you put that spreadsheet, the simulated model in front of you, there is not one piece of outcome data in it.
No, that's right.
It's a weighting-based structure.
But
And I think that's the gap that I see.
easy enough to fill the gap. That gap.
Thank you.
Yep.
There are other questions around this, and I think Dick raises a very interesting one about, I was looking, because we've got a lot of consolidated districts in the rural communities, and you get Walpole and Charlestown in the same district, and the vast differences, and it's driven off of the performance, but ultimately you got one school district that's trying to feed both, serve both of those, and now the taxing is going to be far different. I mean, it suggests that the taxing is different, but ultimately they're only going to have a pool of resources, right? And if there are these flat rates, as the model, so long as the rates are flat, then everyone is essentially contributing at a minimum, and the district is getting the difference for the students who are coming from the communities that have disparities. I think this is doable and explainable. The methodology, I mean, if we can't explain it to 16 of us, we're sunk.
Well, maybe we should also just sort of bring back, I mean, maybe it's Caitlin Davis from the department to talk specifically about the co-op or consolidated districts. And, we know from the DOE adequacy model that they use right now, it's a spreadsheet that looks very much like what AIR has put together. So it doesn't show the districts, it shows the dollars for cities and towns. And that's why we emphasized with Drew and Jesse and Bruce, and Tammy at AIR, the importance that we follow what the DOE is currently doing in terms of showing that funding on a city and town basis. But so it's being done right now. How does that translate to what a co-op uses, and under how it's done right now? I don't think we've had that conversation yet. Have we, Jay?
We haven't. I think it's a good one to come back to. The school business officers, though, they'll nail this one, really easy. I mean, they don't get the same dollars per student, nor for, and they put it together, right? I mean, all dollars are fungible. Yeah. Bill, it's like higher education. No student pays the same amount, but they all get the same education.
No, I know. I just think it's important that we have to be able to explain. If our formula has got two regression models that are too difficult to explain, it can't possibly be the basis for public.
Yeah, I get it. The good news, all these definitions, they are in statute. All these outcome measures, they're there. All of these disparity measures are already described. So I don't think that what we're proposing falls, even requires a whole lot of different. There is one section of statute that does need some change to say that we're not an input-driven model, that it is based on performance.
All right. Well, we're not going to fix all of that in fiscal policy.
Come on.
Not this morning. Save it for 3 o'clock.
Sorry to miss that. I'm so sorry to miss it. Thank you.
Yeah, see you all then.
All right. We'll see everybody. 1 o'clock is public engagement. 3 is adequacy. It's the same link. So anybody else, anything for the good of the cause? All right. Enjoy your lunch. We'll see you back in a bit.